All right. Well, we've looked at Genesis 1:1 and we said really that's sort of the title that's going to help us understand the nature of God and the importance of God to the people of Israel so that they can understand that their God is greater than those ancient Near Eastern gods. Then what we did is we moved into Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, and we looked at this idea that God has this world and it's formless and it's void and there's darkness over it and the Spirit of God is moving and he's going to then do something on the first 6 days of creation. And that's when we moved into that. We said that God then created a world and he took that formless world and he gave it form. And they went from that formless world that has form and then he filled that. And we saw that days 1 and 4 were parallel, days 2 and 5 were parallel, and days 3 and 6 were parallel. And now what we're going to do is we're going to move into this whole idea of man as the image of God. And honestly, to me, this is one of those doctrines that people certainly talk a lot about, but I feel like they very often remove it from its context, which is here in Genesis 1:26 through 28. And what we're going to do in this is just try to understand what does it mean for the man and the woman to be God's image? And why would Moses have shared this with the people of Israel? And clearly, he wants them to understand that you are God's representatives in the world, and therefore you need to understand what it means to image him rightly before the world. So let's begin by just looking at, and you can read the verse on your own, but we're going to begin just to work our way through this verse. And so when we look at this, and I'll be looking down here because I need to see my Bible, it says, Then God said, let us make man in our image. Well, the first thing you have to ask is, who is the us? Well, this takes us right back to Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, and we introduced the idea that there is God who created, and there was the Spirit of God who was moving over the earth. Well, the us then is somehow we have unity in terms of who God is, but we also have this idea of plurality. And so we can read the New Testament back into the Old Testament, understanding that the us is really speaking of the Trinity, that God is one, right? And therefore he has one divine nature. And in that one divine nature, he expresses it through three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. So the us, I believe, is just a statement of pre-Trinitarianism, or the idea that God is one, yet he has somehow has plurality, but certainly that there are not multiple gods, because he's arguing against that with the surrounding nations. So there's no way he's going to argue against something that he actually himself represents. Okay, the second thing we need to see is the verses 26 to 28. The means are the means, and verse 28 is the goal. So just understanding how those verses work themselves out. And so if we look at verse 26, it says, Let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let him rule over the sea and over the birds and the sky and over the cattle and over all the earth and over everything that creeps on the earth. So this is speaking of the means, how God was going to fulfill the goal, which comes out in 28. The second part of the means is he created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them in the image of God. And then that's going to be the means by which he's going to do the goal. And the goal is this in verse 28. And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful, multiply, fill, subdue, and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky. And so what I want us to see, though, is God's goal is that the man is going to represent God in the world, and he's going to rule in God's place. Therefore, that means in Moses' context, he's telling the people that you have a very specific role in our world, and that is that you are going to rule in the place of God on behalf of God. You need to represent him, and you need to represent his interests. Okay? And this makes perfect sense to the people of Israel because they knew that the other ancient Near Eastern countries around them, they also had images of God. But those images of God were only the rulers of that country, and that their God or their many gods would rule through that ruler to accomplish that which that God wanted to do. And so with that, we begin to understand this idea of man as the image of God. One is that he is supposed to rule in the place of God, and two is that he is supposed to represent God and his interests in the world. But secondly, what we begin to see is it says that the man and the woman are equally the image of God. Now, for the people at Moses' time in a patriarchal society in which all the surrounding nations were also patriarchal, it begins to establish that, you know what, even though there's going to be differences in roles and responsibility between the man and the woman, in a patriarchal society, the men still have to value and understand that women are equally made in the image of God and therefore have equal value, equal dignity, and this becomes an important point. All right, then what we begin to see is when we look at the goal, or verse 28, it says, be fruitful, multiply, and what? Fill. You're going to see that this is the reverse order that was given when God was creating, right? Because God first gave form and then he filled. Man is going to first fill, and then as he fills, he is going to give it form. And this becomes important because what we said earlier is that God was establishing for man how he was to live in the world as his image bearer, how he's to rule on behalf of God. So it's the role and the job of man, specifically Adam, and then it's going to extend to Israel, which then means it's going to extend to us. And so again, if you're trying to understand what why you're here and what the purpose of your being here is, that you need to really pay attention to this. So the first thing that Adam was to do and that the nation is to do is to fill the world. And then it goes on and says, and so be fruitful, multiply, and fill. And as you do that, then you need to subdue and then you need to rule. And what's very interesting is when we think of Adam, the world that he was in, God had already created. There was no sin in the world, but it says that he needs to subdue it. What is he subduing? And so we're going to see what he was subduing when we get to chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. But in the meantime, what we want to understand is that he was supposed to take this unfinished world and he was supposed to continue to give it greater and greater form. So man was to first fill and then give form, the exact reverse of what God did. And the reason that makes sense, right? Because God started from nothing, and then he created this ball of darkness and voidness and something that was formless. And then he creates everything, right? And then he fills it. Well, now man has this finished but imperfect product, and man is then to start with the idea of filling it. And as he fills it, he is going to expand the borders of the garden, as we'll see, and that he is then to give it form, making the outside of the garden like that of the inside of the garden. All right. Next, what we need to understand is this idea of how to understand the word image. And you can understand it in two ways. One is it's a verb. It's something that you do. It's mankind's actions, right? That you are to rule on my behalf. Secondly, though, it deals with mankind's essence, meaning that man is the image of God. It's a noun, okay? It's something that we are. If you want to define who you are, your true identity, you are an image bearer. And we're going to see that when the fall takes place, the verb aspect of man's ability to rule on behalf of God is affected. But the noun side, the essence of who we are, was never affected. And therefore, because the essence defines our value, it defines human dignity, it explains the issue of race, it gets rid of racism, it explains the issue of the sexes and the difference between male and female, and it gets rid of sexism. And it begins to help us to understand that every human being has tremendous value and has tremendous dignity. And we have to understand that. But if you are not a Christian and you do not believe that man is made in the image of God, you have no basis to say that any human being has value or dignity. You can state that, but you don't have a basis for that. And so we as Christians need to really grasp this and understand that whether a person's rich or poor, whether they have power or no power, whether they are born or unborn, whether they have tremendous intellectual capacity or that they have some kind of diminished intellectual capacity or whatever, every human being is worthy of dignity and needs to be valued as important. Then what we want to do is actually define the image of God. And this is my working definition of the image of God based on Genesis chapter 1, really in its entirety, is that the man and the woman are made in the image of God, that's the noun, and image God, that's the verb, by representing God and his interests in the world. By turning chaos, remember that was the chaos of Genesis 1-2, into divine order, the very thing the Spirit of God did over the first 6 days of creation. And so I will try to unpack it just a little bit more, but what I really want us to understand is, look, if you're trying to understand what is my purpose in this world, because that was the very thing that Moses was trying to do with the people. If you want to understand who you are and why you're here, this nails it. That you and I, the Israelites, Adam and Eve, were made in the image of God, and therefore we have tremendous value. We have dignity. And we image God, meaning that we are to be ruling on God's behalf. We represent God and his interests. It's not about us, it's not about our interests, but it's about God and his interests. And we represent those interests in the world by turning chaos, right? And we now live in a sinful world. The people at Moses' time lived in a sinful world, and they were to take this chaos and to bring divine order. And that is exactly what we're supposed to do. And that is why we share Christ. That is why we raise our children in the admonition of the Lord, and we discipline them when we need to, because they have chosen not to follow God. But that is what we are here about. And so we need to know what are God's interests, then we need to represent those interests. And then finally, as we think about the relevance today, first is the area of human dignity, value, and worth. Okay, and I can't stress this enough. We have so many social ills because people just are totally disconnected from God. And because they're disconnected from God, they really don't understand why they're here. And so you get things, whether it's the issue of homosexuality or gender fluidity, people just trying to figure out, why am I here and who am I? But if we can just help them to understand that you are made in the image of God, that your essence is the image of God, and that the fall did not affect that, and that you have value and dignity. And it's not in you're trying to pretend that you're this or that, or that you have these overwhelming feelings that you want to act upon. God is saying, no, that you are my child in the sense that you are made in the image of God and you have dignity, value, and worth. Second, is it provides us with direction. When you wake up in the morning, whether you're going to work or whether you're going to raise your children or whether you're going to go to have coffee with your neighbor, you have one simple task: to represent God and his interests in the world, and to take the chaos of that person's life and to try to introduce divine order. And so hopefully you're gathering the absolute tremendous significance of these verses and just how important they are as we think about what our role is in this world, and as we think about how we can best spend each day of our life serving God. I have benefited tremendously from this. It has ordered everything I do and how I think, and I hope that if you believe what I've just said, that you will also benefit from this too. So, thank you.